Hey guys, it's Bales. I'm at FanDuel and going to review a couple lineups from week 6 that I had on both FanDuel and DraftKings. And the first was in the Monster. This is the 333. I was fortunate to get first and third in this for 130K. Sandwich between my two lineups is one from Ian Johns, a poker player who was actually seated with Barstool Nate. If you followed the World Series of Poker at all, we did a deal with Barstool Sports, and Ian, I think, is one of the guys who brought Nate down in that tournament. But he's a sharp guy and finished with 172. My lineups in first and third were 175 and 169. They were very similar. Went with a game stack, sort of a game stack in each, with Palmer, Fitzgerald, and Deshaun Jackson in the same game. I've been doing that more, and you'll see on DraftKings in a second. Sometimes load up on games quite a bit more than that if I think it could turn into a shootout, and this one obviously did. 38-33. Got really lucky, I think, with Deshaun Jackson scoring on a slant in the red zone. I think he had like a 4-yard red zone touchdown in his career red zone. I haven't looked at it lately, but his career red zone rate, at least a little while ago, was like 12% or something like that, and the league average is closer to 23 or 24%. So he typically won't be getting too many looks down there. But yeah, I used that game stack with Mark Ingram, who I liked quite a bit. So he was one of my top running backs across DraftKings and FanDuel. Le'Veon Bell, who I did not think was going to be in 27% of lineups. Much easier to get those expensive guys on FanDuel, especially the expensive running backs. I think you're justified in paying up. Same thing with Gronk, who's typically easier to fit into your lineup on FanDuel, and he was only 13%, so that was pretty surprising, and I think helped me take this down, obviously. And then the ownership on both of these guys, McManus, and the Texans D. McManus at 10%, just didn't see that. The reason that I used him in the first place, one of them was that the Broncos were, I forget, like 12-point favorites, something like that. And they were projected really well in terms of points, but a lot of times DFS players won't use guys in games that are projected to be blowouts, or maybe the kickers aren't going to be making as many attempts, whether they're up or down. They're just going to be going for touchdowns or just not kicking field goals. And I think that's just like pretty hard to predict, and certainly more difficult to predict than if teams are just going to score a lot of points. Didn't work out in this case for me. McManus was awful, and actually, if we look in the 100, I got these same lineups, got second and sixth, but I was 5 points out for another 50K behind the Chipotle addict with McManus in there, and he missed the 2 field goals, and of course they only scored 10 points, so that wasn't a great sweat. But that was the reason that I thought that he was going to be lower owned than he was, and I really don't know why he was in 10%. I guess the price being down at 4,900 is relatively cheap. But same type of thing with, you can see Texans 3.1 in this, 2.4 at higher stakes, suggesting maybe they weren't as good of a play as I thought. I believe every lineup I'll review has the Texans, and so I had them quite a bit, stacked them with Lamar Miller, who didn't do well in a bunch of lineups. So this one you can see pretty similar, but I have Lamar Miller, McKinnon, who I had on both sites, more so on DK, where you'll see he was a lot more highly owned, as he should have been, being cheaper and having the full PPR there. And so can go to FantasyLabs. I'm just looking back at these are my the actual lineups I submitted on FanDuel. So here's that top lineup, that one right here. You can see that we had it projected at 11.2 average ownership. Median projection of 121 points. Let's see what the ceiling was. The ceiling is what we expect the lineup to score in the top 15% of outcomes. So that was, looks like it was that lineup. That was 187. And so, yeah, the amazing thing to me with the ownership is how accurate Adam Levitan does that for us, how accurate he is with it. So there's a couple misses with McManus and Houston, who I thought I was in line with him. I thought McManus would be much lower, maybe 2 to 4. Houston in that 9 to 12 range that they weren't. But otherwise, you can see he's very, very close on all of the players that I used, and of course, accurately projecting ownership. We all know ownership is important, but the value of it extends only insofar as you can accurately project it. So him being there behind the scenes and projecting ownership is obviously incredibly crucial. I use that a lot. I use it for cash games, even just because he's so on top of things and understands who the chalk's going to be. And then on the left side, you can see my top exposure. So I think at that lineup, I had most of my top exposures, not at running back. I had Gurley on FanDuel. I think that might have been a mistake, but I didn't have much of him on DK. But you can see Palmer, Ingram is there. Fitzgerald, my top receiver by far, 42%. Gronk, top tight end. Houston D. So, yeah, that's what I had on FanDuel. Now we'll look at DraftKings. This is my top lineup. I didn't do that well. I didn't do well at all, actually, on DK. And that'll happen, I think, more for me maybe than the average person, because I will play certain guys. I use the bargain rating at Labs, not in like a predictive way per se, as in terms of who to play, but in terms of where I should play them. So we're looking at FanDuel. Yesterday, Carson Palmer was the third best value if you look at the price difference between FanDuel and DraftKings, and so I tried to get the majority of my exposure to him on FanDuel. So sometimes I just like guys and play them across sites, and that happens a lot, but I think most people figure out the guys that they like and they just play them on both sites. And I probably will play certain guys more so on other sites, to the point that I have all or nearly all of my exposure, like in the case of Gurley or something like that, on the site where they are the cheapest, which does influence ownership, but not probably as much as it should. So yeah, you can see this lineup was actually very similar, but there are a few differences, and this was more of a full game stack where I went Palmer, Fitzgerald, John Brown, and then on the opposite side, I double stacked without a quarterback with Evans and Cameron Brate, who both of those guys scored, and of course this game turned into the shootout late. So overall, have pretty low ownership on this lineup outside of two guys, Julio, who you can just plug in almost any matchup, and this was a good one, and he just didn't perform that well, still hasn't scored this year. And then McKinnon, who I had a bunch of, maybe my top exposure, I think, Ingram, McKinnon at running back overall, and he did well. And you can see I also had the Texans D in this one, stacked again with Lamar Miller. So idea, of course, being that if the Texans are up, that Miller's going to get more carries. I think Miller was I was just too high on Miller in hindsight. With it's not like he's Le'Veon Bell or something where you can just be certain that he's going to get a certain number of carries. Let's look up my worst lineup. So this was also in the 444, I think. How many people were in this? This had to be one of the worst lineups. 5505, 5496. So very close to one of the worst lineups. Rodgers got hurt, obviously. Andre Ellington, 0 points. Lamar Miller, not stacked with the Texans D in this case. And then Amari Cooper, who I had a bunch of. That was my big miss, and one of the reasons that on DK I didn't really do that well. I had Amari Cooper was my top receiver by a lot on DraftKings. It was Fitzgerald on FanDuel, Amari Cooper on DraftKings. He was $5K. I believe he had the highest price drop ever on DraftKings in such a short period of time. I think he started the season 8,100, and it was the greatest drop that any player's ever had. Yeah, I don't know. It's you guys can send your Cooper tweets to CSU Ram 88, and I'm sure he'll have some responses to to why Cooper's not doing well. So you can see all my exposures on DraftKings if you go to NFL contest dashboard. I have a few other players selected here. Smizzle, B. Calicore, who is a FantasyLabs. He's on Team FantasyLabs, and Brandon Adams, who's been doing really well. You can see BA had 60% Julio, but this is a cool way to just sort through, and you can look at some of the top players, or any player in any contest. You can look at their exposure. So this is the Millionaire Maker. Smizzle had 150 lineups. He maxed this out, and you can see he went McKinnon and Thielen, and Fournette as his top, all over 42%. So that obviously worked out well. High exposure to Ingram as well. You can see how my exposures compared, and just compare what you're doing to players who you respect. And then finally, I tweeted this out the yesterday morning. Actually, we're about to launch it. It's a prop betting dashboard, but I'll have a tutorial, and you can learn more about it then. But you can select different positions, different sports books. We'll add more there. Whatever stat you want to look at, search for players, and then you can see their props, and this updates in real time. And then we're looking at it from both a DFS perspective and a sports betting perspective. So if you want to bet on the prop, you can look at what we believe are the most inefficient lines, the biggest differences between our projection at FantasyLabs and the whatever the prop is at a book. And then we also have a Vegas sort of projected value system, where if Vegas is projecting all of a player's stats, we know how many fantasy points they think he's going to score, and we can compare that to his salary and look at value like that. So that could be something that we incorporate into models, and maybe you can back test and use the props as your projections, more or less, if you think that those are accurate. But excited to launch this, and good luck in week 7.